Welcome to Vineyard Boise. It's our vision to make the invisible God visible wherever He places us. We come together on Sundays to worship and fellowship corporately. But we know that church isn't just about Sunday. It's about a lifelong, day-to-day following of Christ with other believers. We invite you to join us, just as you are. If you'd like to support our ministry, visit vineyardboise.org and click the Give Online button.
This morning, we're going to be in, if you're joining us for the first time, we're doing a series where we're studying through 1st and 2nd Samuel, which are some Old Testament books. 1st and 2nd Samuel are largely, they're the stories of the first two kings of Israel. So the first king was Saul. He was a king that really reflected what the people what they thought they wanted in a king. And then David is the second king, and he reflects what God wants to give the people in a king. And so today we're in David's story. It's 1 Samuel chapter 25. I titled this passage, Patience in the Process. And this particular chapter, this episode, is set in what we call David's fugitive years. So here's what that means. David was anointed king by a prophet named Samuel. Samuel came to David, saw him out, and amongst all his brothers, he was the youngest, and he said, God has chosen you to be the next king of Israel. Saul was still on the throne at this point. But he says, God has chosen you to be the next king of Israel. And he prayed over him, and he anointed him with oil and said, this is your anointing. This is your calling. But then he didn't become king right away. There was a gap between the anointing and between the appointing. And that gap was actually significant. That wasn't measured in weeks or months or years. It was measured in decades. And a significant part of that time was David living as a fugitive. He was living on the run. Because what happened is Saul knew that there was somebody that was going to replace him. The word that had been given to Saul through the same prophet Samuel was, God has chosen a neighbor of yours. Didn't name him, but said, a neighbor of yours who is better than you, because he's chosen to have a heart after me. And he has a heart like mine. And so where Saul went with that is he went into this jealous suspicion, and he began surveying the landscape, constantly on the lookout for who might be that better neighbor who's a threat to his throne. And so he suspects his own son. He tries to kill his own son as a potential threat, and he's tried to kill David. He's observed not only David's leadership capacity and his military capacity, but he's observed the way people respond to David. And David's a threat to him. So he's tried to kill him. And as we pick up the story, I want to share with you a few points of context just to put this story in its context. So again, David has been anointed by Samuel as God's choice to be Israel's next king. King Saul has become increasingly jealous of David and has made multiple threats, not just threats, but actually attempts on his life. He's thrown spears at David and just missed. And David has taken up refuge with the Philistines, where he feigned insanity so as to appear non-threatening. Now here's how bad this was. Here's how scared David was for his life. That he decides it's safer for him to go and hide with Israel's enemies, the Philistines, than to stay put in Israel where Saul has access to him. Okay? Now think about that. If the Philistines are not only Israel's enemy, they hate David specifically. Because David killed their giant, their champion. He killed Goliath. So they hate David, but David is so in fear for his life with Saul that he thinks, I'll be safer with the Philistines. And when he gets there, they know who he is, and so he feigns insanity. He feigns like he's a madman so that they don't think he's a threat anymore. But pretty soon he realizes that he's not safe there either, so he returns back to Israel, but now he hides in the wilderness of southern Israel in a cave. He's taking refuge in a cave. So here's what this means. The future king of Israel is living on the run. He's hiding from King Saul, who's actually using the army. Saul is, as king, he's commander-in-chief. He's using the standing army of Israel to hunt David. And so now he's living on the run, he's hiding, and he's not just hiding from Saul, but now he's hiding from the Philistines. He's living in a cave, and I have to think that David must have wondered at some of those times. Again, this is measured in decades. We don't know the exact time frame. It's measured in decades. And you have to think that at times he wondered about that prayer when Samuel came to him and called him out and said, God has chosen you to be the next king. I have to think if he questioned that, like, God, was that really you? Or was that just Samuel? Was that just Samuel being Samuel? Like, was that you? And if so, what are you doing? Why am I on the run in the wilderness? This is unjust. Why? What are you doing? But as he was there in the cave, something began to shift, and people began to join him. Listen to how it started. This is 1 Samuel 22. David departed from there, and the there is the Philistines. It's Gath of the Philistines. He departed from there, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all of his father's house heard it, they went down to him there. And everyone, this is who begins to join him, everyone who is in distress, everyone who is in debt, everyone who is bitter in soul, gathered to him, and he became commander over them. There's about 400 of them. Now, that's not a fun group to hang out with. Like when you're putting together the dinner party and you're thinking about who would I really enjoy hanging out with, spending time with, you don't think about who are all the bitter, bankrupt, disenfranchised, who are those people? I want them to come. But that's who comes to him there, and there's 400 of them. Again, I don't think this is what David pictured when Samuel first anointed and prayed over him. Nevertheless, David begins to act in accordance to what was prayed over him. Okay, he doesn't have the position, he doesn't have the title yet, but he begins to act faithfully to that call, which was to serve Israel. And since Saul is using the army to hunt David, no one's fighting Israel's battles. And so now when an invading enemy, a neighbor comes in to invade Israel, David uses this band of misfits, the bankrupt, bitter misfits. He uses them to fight Israel's battles. He helps free a city. He helps free a tribe. He fights for their freedom. And in their gratefulness, this is how they respond. They say, to his face, they say, thank you. Thank you for using your band of bitter misfits to save us. And then behind his back, they reach out to Saul and they say, we know where David is. If you want him, we'll turn him over to you, because they want favor with the king. So this is David's life, living on the run, using his band to fight Israel's enemies, and doing this for a people who are very ungrateful. Okay, one more point of context. For chapter 25, we're in chapter 25 today. In the Hebrew Bible, that's set in between chapters 24 and 26, okay? That's the sequence. Just kind of like ours, but different. This is bracketed by chapter 24 and 26. Both tell stories in which David has the opportunity to kill Saul, thus speeding up the process of God's promise by taking matters into his own hands. In both cases, his men, the bankrupt and bitter, disenfranchised misfits, they come alongside, they say, David, this is your chance. God has given him into your hands. This is God's doing. Now just seize the moment, take his life, end our life as fugitives, end this injustice of us fleeing for our lives, end this oppression of Israel in which Israel has a madman on the throne who is not acting in Israel's interest. Like, end it. And you have to think that would be tempting to David. If I was in David's shoes, that would be very tempting. But David, somehow he knew that was not the way that God would have him ascend the throne. He knew that would be against God's character, against God's nature, and it would be against the way he'd been called to live. Remember, he has a heart after God. And so he intuitively knows that, and he restrains these 400 men who are, these are ruffians. This is a rough crowd. But he not only restrains his own heart, he restrains these men and says, no, we will not touch the Lord's anointed. We will not lay a hand on him. We will not take power by our own action. We will let God establish us. We will let God establish me. Okay? So that's David's pattern. That's his basic character. And in the middle of this, in between those two opportunities to take Saul's life, we find chapter 25 in which he makes a different choice. Verse 1, now Samuel died and all Israel assembled and mourned for him. And they buried him in his house at Ramah. And then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Don't skip over this additional context, because what this tells us is that in addition to all the things David's been experiencing of life on the run, he's now also grieving. He's grieving the loss of his spiritual father. This is the man who had faith for him, who spoke into his life, who called something out of him, a favorable future that he couldn't even imagine. And now Samuel's gone, and that future is the furthest from reality. And so David's living with that tension of like, he's gone, he never saw it, was it real? And he's grieving. Verse 2, and there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. I think we all know what that means. Actually, I don't know what that means. The Calebites don't have a bad reputation in the Old Testament, but the author says it is interesting. So if your name's Caleb, I don't know what to tell you. But what we do know is this, and here's what we find out. Later in the text, Abigail will say to David, she'll say, Nabal's name it means foolish, it means folly, and it actually fits, which is a really unfortunate thing for his parents to have given him that name, right? If you are currently expecting or will be adding to your family, I would encourage you not to consider names like fool, jerk, stupid, right? Don't call that out in your children. Don't put that over them. But this is the name he has. I've wondered, we started this morning by saying, think of something to be thankful for about your mom. And again, we've had various experiences of our own parents. And so some of that might be a more conscious choice to think about those things. I would suggest that there are things in every one of us that we can be thankful for, to choose to find that and to call that out. But I've wondered if he ever sent his mom a Mother's Day card. Like, Mom, I just want to thank you for being so insightful to have named me fool, because it so fits me. And Scripture doesn't tell us that he ever did that. But, we won't argue for silence. Here's what I'll say. He never did that. You know why? Fools don't know they're fools. It's the very nature of being foolish is that it's a blind spot. We're going to find out that everybody does foolish things. The fools refuse to recognize it. The wise receive feedback and adjust. That's the question. Which are we? Verse 4, David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. Now, sheep shearing is kind of the context for this encounter that's about to happen. Sheep shearing was a festival. It was a celebration. It was a party day. Because the rancher, the guy who owns all the livestock, he's shearing his sheep. This is his harvest. It's the wool. He's shearing his sheep, and what he does in the context of that is he counts them all, and then he gives rewards to the shepherds who've been caring for the sheep according to how well they've done. And according to how many have multiplied, how many are missing, he rewards them. Okay, so this is a big party. Verse 5, so David sent 10 young men, 10 of his now 600. David's, again, this is the wilderness years, wilderness decades, where he started with 400 malcontent guys. That's now grown to 600. He sends 10 of them on an errand. He says to the young men, go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. This is important. Peace be to you. Peace be to your house. Peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now, your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Okay, when he says they missed nothing, that has a twofold meaning. One, it means we were their defenders. We protected them from invaders, from thieves, and we protected them from wild animals. So that's the first meaning. They didn't miss anything from thieves or animals, but secondly, they didn't miss anything from us. In other words, David's got this band of mighty men who are living in the wilderness, who are hungry, who it would be very reasonable to think that these guys might decide to take a tax for their service. This is the Hebrew mafia saying, we're giving you protection. Our part is, we get a sheep or two every now and then. They've missed nothing. David has not taken anything for the services. It's understandable that David would have a soft spot in his heart for shepherds. I think that's maybe part of this. Verse 8, this is the message to Nabal. Ask your young men, they will tell you. Therefore, let my young man find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please, give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son, David. This is very respectful. He comes in peace. He calls himself his son, David. This is just in the Asian culture of their day, this would have been just a matter of respect. So here's the question. How does David, as the commander of these now 600 men, how does he provide for them in the wilderness? They're living on the run. The Costco is far, far away. How does he provide for these guys? And what he's been banking on is he's been banking on the reciprocating generosity of Israeli sheep herders and landowners, that as he affords them services, that they would reciprocate with some kindness, with some thankfulness. And as tempting as it's been, he's not allowed his men to steal from the Israelites, from their flocks. Verse 9, when David's young men came, they said all of this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David, servants, who's David? Who's the son of Jesse? Those are the first air quotes in Scripture. Who's the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water, my meat that I have killed for my shearers, and give it to men who come from I did not know where? Okay. This response is foolish. It's snarky. And in his snarky response, it shows that he knows exactly who David is and exactly what the story is. When he says, there's a lot of servants breaking away from their masters, it shows us that he knows the background of who David has been to Saul and what is happening right now. So he knows this whole story, and he chooses to just close his hand. He's very rich, but you can be very rich and very foolish. He closes his hand and says, no, this is all mine. God has given this man the capacity to do what he's done, and this is all, God says that we're stewards of whatever we have. We don't hold it in a closed fist if it's ours, but he says, this is all mine. So David's young men turned and they came back and they told David all of this. And David said to his men, every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. Don't miss this. David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. So the first delegation David sent were 10 men. That was not a show of force. That was not intimidating. It was a kind envoy sent to make a peaceful request, and enough men that could carry back whatever gift Nabal might choose to send back with David. It's enough men to carry it. That was the first envoy. The second delegation is going to be a show of force, and they're going to make a point. David doesn't tell the men when he says, put your swords on. He doesn't say, here's what we're going to do. But later in the chapter, two separate times in verse 22 and 34, David reveals what he plans to do with his 400 armed men. He plans to slaughter every male in Nabal's household. Every male, every child, every boy, every teen, every man, including all of the shepherds that they've actually been doing life with out in the wilderness. He's going to slaughter them all. I want to ask you if you think that's a proportionate response. Does that seem a little out of balance? I mean, after all, David, he has a reasonable expectation that Nabal, when Nabal finds out, because Nabal hasn't known about all this, his servants affirm this is what's happened. When Nabal finds out about this, he has a reasonable expectation that Nabal would respond with kindness, with generosity. But there's no contract, there's no agreement. And though Nabal's foolish and boorish, he's not harmed David, he's just insulted him. But here comes David with the intention of unleashing all of his bitter misfits on every male in Nabal's household. So what's happening? How is this out of character? And I think, when David was faced with a choice to take the king's life in 24 and 26, he knows that's not right. But there's a blind spot in David's character about how he treats the common person, about how he treats the person who doesn't have a title, and whether or not he will go to battle for his own ego and for his own pride and take matters into his own hand. This is the blind spot for David. And he reacts, and I was thinking about it this week, and I was studying the story. It reminded me of something that Andrea and I learned a few years back. We were feeling just particularly stuck and didn't know how to get forward. And so we saw a family counselor. And one of the things that he explained to us was this, he explained the process that happens in the human brain called the amygdala hijack. This is what psychologists call the amygdala hijack. Has anybody heard of this? Okay, you're going to learn something today. Amygdala hijack. Here's what it is. The amygdala is the structure within the temporal lobe of our brains responsible for our fight or flight reaction when faced with a threat. Now, the threat could be a real threat or a perceived. The amygdala doesn't distinguish between real and perceived. When it perceives threat, it responds, it reacts. So faced with a threatening situation, our thalamus, which is a different part of the brain, it's the part that receives the incoming stimuli, it sends signals to both the amygdala and to the cortex. And if the amygdala perceives danger, it makes a split-second decision and begins the fight or flight reaction before the cortex has time to overrule it. Okay, simply speaking, the amygdala, which actually it's two small parts, but it's responsible for the emotional reactions, while the cortex is responsible for more conscious thought, like rational processing, rational thought. But when this happens, when the amygdala takes over, it hijacks the cortex. It hijacks the whole process, and the cortex is drowned out. When this happens, the result is an unconscious emotional reaction that shuts down the cortex and floods the system with stress hormones like cortisol, making it hard to think clearly about the situation. Thus, the hijack. If allowed to happen, this hijacking can take hours to calm down from, because there's all sorts of adrenaline, all sorts of the cortisol, everything that's flooding the system. It can take hours to calm down from, and in retrospect, the intense emotional reaction will be recognized as inappropriate in relation to the situation. But meanwhile, great damage may have already been done. I would suggest this is what's happening with David, but I just want to pause. This is relevant because this happens to us today. We're whole people. We're body, mind, spirit, soul. And this is something that happens on a physiological level that has a spiritual component. We're going to see that there's a spiritual component with this, but on a physiological level, this is something we deal with, and it can become a habit in our lives, where something happens that triggers us, that makes us feel threatened. Maybe it's just our ego's been threatened. That's what's happening with David. I mean, look, he's been living in fear for his life. He's living in fear for how to provide for his friends, and now his ego's been threatened. And he's been in flight mode, and he switches to fight mode, and it's split second. Get on your sword. And he goes on the attack. And this happens in our lives. It happens in our relationships. Oftentimes it happens in the people that we're closest to. Family members, friends, spouses, children, parents. And we react because we feel threatened in some way. We feel attacked, we feel misunderstood, and we go on the attack, and then we say things that we can't take back, or we take actions that we can't undo. We can apologize for them later, but destruction has happened in the relationship. And sometimes that becomes intolerable. Sometimes it's too much. Whether you've been on the receiving end of that or the giving end of that, I think probably all of us have done both. The question is there a way forward? Well, if you're a fool, there's not, because you won't recognize it for what it is. You'll defend that it was an appropriate response. But if you have the wisdom to listen, to take the words of somebody who might speak into your life and say, hey, there's some ways you're responding, reacting to your loved ones that are wrong, that are sinful, that are inappropriate, then maybe there's hope. Because then you're open to not just dealing with it on a physiological level, but inviting God into that. And when God enters into that, it's all different. You might have deeply ingrained habits that you can't break, but the Spirit of the living God that raised Jesus from the dead, if you let him in, he can do all kinds of things. Here's what happens. David, in God's mercy, David's not asking God for help on this one. He doesn't say David prayed and then said, get on your swords. David he's going rogue here. This is independent. So he's not listening to God. He's not asking God. And in God's mercy, because God's still shaping David's character, David has a blind spot that will affect the way he rules once he's on the throne. And God's shaping him. Again, what's God doing in the gap in between the anointing and appointing? He's shaping him to be somebody who can be entrusted with the very promises God wants to give him. Right now, he's not. He can't be entrusted with power. Not entirely. Do you think that David, if he goes forward with this, do you think he'll look back with regret when his emotions and when the cortisol subsides? I'd suggest he will, just based on what we know about him in 24 and 26. This is out of character, and he's choosing it. Back to our story. Meanwhile, so Meanwhile, I'm going to summarize some things, not going to read the text. Abigail, Nabal's wife, is told by the shepherds about David's request and about her husband's response. She immediately goes to intercept David and his men, sending a lavish care package of food ahead of her. Now, this is brilliant. I don't think that Abigail had a psychological textbook out and was reading about the amygdala hijack. It's a relatively new concept and recognition. But I think God sends her, and he gives her the wisdom to know what to do. And here's what psychologists say. When somebody is in the midst of amygdala hijack, once that's happened, once the cortisol has flooded the system, there's no rationalizing with them. And oftentimes that's what we do if we want to rationalize with the person who's in the midst of that emotional reaction, and it actually just exacerbates the problem and makes it worse. Because they feel like a continual attack. You're still attacking me. You're telling me I'm wrong. And it just exacerbates it. So the key is to call a timeout, to take a pause. If you're on the flip side of this, if you're on the receiving end of this, don't try and engage someone who's in this, just step away. Just create a pause. You want to circle back to this, but let things settle a little bit. If this is you, if you get in this situation, when you feel yourself ramping up and you're about to do something that you know you're going to regret later, but in the moment you feel this righteous indignation that it's right and you feel angry, put yourself in a timeout. Just leave the room if you have to. Say, I gotta go. Leave, let things settle, and then circle back and deal with it. What she does, Nabal's wife, she sends this lavish gift of food. I mean, so much more food than Nabal would have ever sent. And she sends it way ahead of her so that David has to stop and receive all this food. And the cortisol settles. And the hijacking relaxes a little bit. And so by the time she gets to him, he's calmed down. When Abigail saw David, she reaches him, he's already got the food. She hurried and got down from the donkey. She fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. What you're going to see in her posture, her literal physical posture, she takes a posture of humility. David's pride and ego has been attacked. She's calming him down. So she takes a posture of humility, and she's going to call him a respectful term in their culture. She's going to call him Lord. That doesn't mean like God. It's just a respectful term like sir. So on the text, as we read through it, we've put when she's talking to David, it's going to be Lord in lowercase. And when she's talking about God as Lord, it's going to be God in all uppercase. So pay attention to how she talks. She fell at his feet and she said, "On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant." Okay, this is the gospel. This is amazing. This is a little foreshadowing of the gospel right here. And what we're used to in David's stories, we're used to seeing David as a foreshadow of Jesus. We see David do things and we go, oh, that's kind of like what Jesus will do one day. When David kills the giant, that Jesus will one day slay the giant of sin and death, right? We're used to seeing David like that. In this case, David is not the foreshadow of Jesus, it's Abigail. Look what she does. She's not at fault, but she takes personal responsibility to bear all of the guilt. And she does what's needed to make it right. Not only that, she places herself in between her people and the coming destruction. This is the gospel. This is what Jesus did for us. And Abigail's, she's unconsciously, she's not consciously doing this, but she's telegraphing that. She's living it out. Verse 25, "Let not my Lord," this is still Abigail talking, "let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal's his name, folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. Now let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. And please forgive the trespass of your servant." Again, she's not responsible, but she takes the guilt. "Please forgive the trespass of your servant." And now, this next few verses, these are so important because this is Abigail prophetically speaking into David's life. What that means is that she is the voice of God, that God is speaking through her because he's not listening to God right now. He's closed his ears. He didn't pray and say, "God, how should I respond?" He just reacted. He's not listening to God. So in God's mercy, God sends another person. And this is what God will do for us. There's times when, as Christians, we're attentive to God's voice, we're humble before him, we're soft. And there's other times where we've allowed sin to harden our heart, or we're caught up in a reaction that we can't see, we've got blind spots. And in God's mercy, he will send us someone. And if we're not a fool, if we'll receive the feedback, the wounds of a friend, then we can grow. And maybe we can get out of the cycle of violence so that our lives are not spent hurting other people, but actually helping others. Which at our core, that's what we're made for. That's to be an image bearer of God, is to live for the sake of others. Listen to God speaking through Abigail to David. For the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house. This is the promise that's been spoken over him that he's waiting for. The Lord will surely make of my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, not your own battles. And evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living, in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken, according to all the promises he spoke through Samuel, when he has done all the good that he has spoken concerning you and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall then have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation for himself. Have no pangs of conscience for having sinned against someone in a moment of an emotionally violent reaction that afterwards looks pretty inappropriate. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. She says, when all this is over, when the dust settles from all this, remember me. Which is important, because here's what happens. David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. David and Nabal are a contrast. We didn't read all the story of Nabal, it was summarized, but when the servants come to Abigail and they say, you better intervene because this just happened and no one can talk to Nabal. He's so foolish, he won't listen to anyone, so you're gonna have to act. That's foolishness, right? But David, when somebody comes to him and calls him on what he's about to do, or calls him on his stuff and says, this is sin, he receives it. And he doesn't just thank her, he thanks God. Thank you for stopping me. Thank you for being so merciful as to intervene in my own foolishness. David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you to this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, your wisdom in how you handled this. You have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. The very thing that he refuses to do in 24 and 26, he says, I was about to do it this time. I was about to use the power and the influence that I've been given to defend my ego for my pride, instead of letting God fight my battles and me choosing to use the influence he's given me to serve others. For as surely as the Lord lives, the God of Israel, surely as he lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning, there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male. Then David received from her hand what she had brought him, and he said to her, go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice. I've granted your petition. In the verses that follow, Nabal wakes up the following day with a hangover, and Abigail fills him in on what happened over the last day. He has some sort of stroke, and then about 10 days later, he dies. And the narrator and David both perceive this to be God's intervention. If we were to look at it on a scientific level, physiologically, there's something that happened. And David sees this as God's provision, as God intervening so that David's not fighting his own battles. I'm going to let you do that, God. Listen to what David says. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, blessed be the Lord, the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife, because she'd said, remember me, when the dust settles, remember me. He takes her as his wife. Story closes with David recognizing that God intervened to keep him from sinful violence, which actually, how do we cultivate the posture where we respond as wise versus foolish? We actually find out that David has been praying for this very thing. We look at the Psalms, many of the Psalms were written by David. They're his prayer life. They're like his prayer journal, and we get a glimpse into David's interior life. And here we find out the type of things that David prays, so that in this moment when faced with Abigail coming and saying, stop, this is not what God has for you, he listens. Listen to what Psalm 19. How can I know all the sins lurking in my own heart? Cleanse me from these hidden faults. Not faults that are hidden to everybody else, the faults that are hidden to him. Keep your servant from deliberate sins. Don't let them control me. Then I will be free of guilt and innocent of great sin. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. You know, what was God doing in David during this gap, this fugitive years? I believe he was shaping David's character to be the one he could actually give the promises to that he planned to give. Through this, David learned that what he was capable of apart from God's intervention, and he had the humility to receive correction through another person. This was very shaping for David's leadership once he was appointed king. God was redeeming all of David: body, mind, heart, spirit, will, amygdala. And David cooperated. I'd suggest if you find yourself in this story, this pattern of the amygdala hijack and the emotional reaction that afterwards you realize was inappropriate and damage was done, there's a spiritual component to this, to opening yourself to God and saying, God, would you intervene? Keep me from great sin. Help me to take the pause. Help me to learn new habits of righteousness. We're going to close today with a story. We're going to shift gears here. This is an awesome story. It's a story about, it's a modern day story, someone from our church who was also waiting for God to act, living in between a time of wanting something and seeing God act, and how God sent another person, a messenger, and then what they learned in the process.
We've been coming to the Vineyard for about 4 years now. We moved here from San Diego. When we did get married, when we first came, we decided to start a family right away.
So after a couple of years of trying, nothing happened. So we went to the doctor and they told us that we only had a 1 in 100,000 chance of conceiving naturally. They recommended that we go straight to in vitro fertilization, which is kind of diving off the deep end. So we took them up on that suggestion. We stayed for a couple of months. We went through the entire process, and in the end, it failed. It failed really bad. So we decided, okay, well, let's wait a couple of months, save up again, and let's try it again. But also at the same time, I was just getting used to the idea of perhaps it might never happen and we might not have a biological child. And at the same time in my head, I was just wondering what was God's plan. All along we had been praying for this child. We wanted a child so bad. And I wasn't sure if God had another plan for us, if he didn't want us to do it scientifically. And so it was Easter, last Easter.
After the service, I'm sitting and I'm waiting to leave. There was somebody that was coming in for the next service sitting at a table.
And so I was sitting at a table alone, just waiting for church to start.
And I walked by her, and as I walked by her, God said, like in my head, hey, I want you to go back and pray for that lady. And I was like, okay, like I don't know her at all, but all right, I'll go. So I walked back to this lady who's still sitting by herself.
I was like, hi. And I was like, hi, do I know you?
And I'm like, hey, do you need prayer for something?
I was just thinking to myself, well, I could always use prayer, but what about? My life's pretty good right now, I think.
And she's like, oh no, I'm fine. And I'm like, great. And I was like, are you sure? She was like, well, there is this one thing, we've been struggling with infertility.
So I told her about infertility, and so she continued to pray for me.
And so I was like, oh, well, that's the thing, let me pray for you for that. She's like, okay. So I start praying a very safe prayer, and right in the middle of it, God totally interrupts me with a picture in my head.
And right in the middle of the prayer, she says, I have a vision. I had a vision.
I really hesitated to give it to her because of what I thought it meant.
And it was a vessel. Maybe a vase or something, but God's hand was pouring water into it.
Until it's like overflowing. And I said, I can't promise you a child.
And she said multiple times, she's like, I don't know what that means. It's not saying that you're gonna get pregnant. I'm not saying that. It might mean something totally different, but that was my vision.
I don't really know any other way to take that though, so can I pray for you to have a child? And she's like, yeah. but kind of unenthusiastic. We were both kind of unenthusiastic because I didn't want to like pray for her to have this miracle baby and like, you're gonna have a baby and then have it not happen. But I didn't really know what else to do. So I just prayed very simply. I said, God, please bless her with a child. And that was about it.
At the end, I said, thank you very much. And we watched service.
And I said, okay, well, I hope you have a happy Easter. And I left.
So I didn't know what that meant. At this time, I was still praying like all the time for a child. But the word that God kept on whispering in my ear was, be patient, be patient, be patient. So fast forward to Mother's Day. We had just gotten back from a trip from San Diego. That entire trip, I was feeling sick to my stomach. I'm a big foodie, and I want to eat everything and anything. But this trip, I didn't want anything. Everything just was, ugh. I had taken thousands of pregnancy tests before that. And in my head, I'm like, let's just take one more. So I went and took one. I know I'm not pregnant because, that's just doesn't happen to me. So I took it, and right away it turned out positive. So I ran outside. Nate was mowing the lawn. And I was waving this pregnancy test. Nate, I'm pregnant.
Yeah.
And he's like, what? I can't hear you. So I tell him to turn off the lawnmower, and I tell him I'm pregnant. And we hug, and we're just so excited. And then I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go back to the couch and lay down. I still feel like, I still feel not good at all. He's like, well, what do I do?
I guess I'll keep mowing the lawn.
So we were just so excited. We had no idea what to expect. We were just excited for anything. The morning sickness all of a sudden was a blessing.
About 8 weeks later, I'm walking in the parking lot of the church, and she comes running over to me. Hey, do you remember me? And I'm like, no. What do you mean? Because she's like, you prayed for me. And I'm going, I pray for a lot of people. Help me out. She's like, for pregnancy. And I said, oh, yeah, okay. Well, what's going on? And she said, I just found out I'm 8 weeks pregnant. I was like, no way. And she said that she counted back the days, and she conceived like the day after I prayed for her.
And so a couple months later, this guy was born. This is Everett.
One thing that was good for us during that time too is Trevor. He's shared his story a couple of times now when they tried to have a kid for 3 years and it wasn't working. And I remember him saying he shook his fist at God. I picture Trevor going like this. But I felt the exact same way. And so it helped us to know that other people went through the same thing and came out on the other side.
And God can really do miracles. And it wasn't me, it was God, but he let me participate, and that was really cool. I feel more, confident in praying for people, even for weird stuff, and for God to move in miraculous ways. So I know her story, of course, was really impactful to her, but she doesn't know that because God did that, like I've gotten to pray for so many more people and had more boldness to do that and seen God move in lots of different ways. So it's pretty cool when God does cool stuff like that.
I'm going to ask Pastor Josh to come up, and as we close today, we wanted to spend some time with an opportunity for ministry. And that may mean you just sitting and doing business with God. Maybe you found yourself in the story of David and his reaction, and you need to be honest with that to receive correction in that, and to repent and to invite God to continue the refining work in you. I think we're also going to have some words for prayer that we're going to put up on the screens. Josh had a specific word to share as far as ministry. We want to take a chance to pray with moms as well.
Yeah, in our culture, we celebrate moms on this day, and that's a wonderful thing. And moms are awesome. We also recognize that sometimes it's not so awesome for some of us. So today I just felt like, if you have a broken relationship with your mother, or you're experiencing a loss, maybe your mother has passed, maybe you would just like something more with your mother, I just felt like God had that solution for you today. He has an answer for you. Whether it's just healing or comfort, and he loves you so much. So I was just a few minutes ago in the Korean service right over here, and they did such a great job of honoring people in the Korean culture. And I just want to say thank you to all the mothers in the room. Thank you very much for your sacrifice. Thank you for raising children. Thank you for loving well. And thank you for carrying really the heart of the Father and the heart of Jesus to the kids. It's important. It's very important. As I was walking up, I also sensed that I just want to say, if you're a single mom in the room or watching with us today, we've got your back. If you need something that we can help with, we will do it. We love you. And we say thank you. So as we finish up, there'll be some folks to pray, and you're always welcome to pray for each other around the tables. But if that's you, if something's happening there, there's one more thing. I heard it right now. I saw it in the lights that I see is some of you in this room, you're called to be foster parents. And I know that's what I do, but there's some foster moms in this room too. And if that's you, go do it.
Thanks, Josh. Would you go ahead and stand with me? And we just want to take a moment to pray over each other, to pray with each other. Again, you're welcome to pray right at the tables. Maybe you came with somebody and you're comfortable just receiving prayer with them or from them. Maybe that's a great fit. We love that when ministry happens at the tables. I'm going to ask our prayer team to be available up front. We're going to put some words for prayer up on the screens. And there may be people here, maybe you identified with Andrea's and my story and with Nate and Allison's story of longing for children and not having that be a reality yet. And if so, we'd love to pray with you about that. We can't promise anything, but we have an extraordinary God. We're ordinary people. I love the way Mandy shared her story because we're ordinary people with an extraordinary God, and we can invite him into those circumstances. So whatever you came with today, we're just going to have our prayer team available all around the front, around the stage, or up underneath the lights, or underneath the screens. And that's how we're going to close today. If you're done and you're ready to leave, you feel free to do that. I just ask you to kind of honor the prayer that's happening in the room and maybe take your conversations into Heritage Hall. Don't forget to grab a bottle, and then let's go make the invisible God visible. Amen.